Hello, I'm Cathal Portair, and I've been asked to give a talk on humanising the famine through the use of folklore. The way that I came to engage with this material in the first place was in 1995, when the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the famine, the Great Famine, was being marked. As happened, I had been an undergraduate and postgraduate student in the Department of Irish Folklore in UCD, and was aware of what the collection contained, even though my previous work had mostly been involved with storytelling and song. I knew that there was a sizable amount of historical lore to do with the famine. The Irish Folklore Commission had been set up in 1935 and had begun collecting with a small number of full-time collectors and a certain number of part-time collectors, who collected material in Irish in the Gaeltacht Irish-speaking areas, and collected material in English-speaking Ireland. So I decided to have a look at that material with a view to making a series or two series of radio programs. The reason I did that was most of the folklore and most of the oral history that's passed on tends to be pitched at a very human level. It's ordinary people talking about what happened in their own area, quite often to maybe relations, parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, if not that, to neighbours, the people who lived around them, people who lived or died during the famine. So what you get is a very local understanding of events on the ground. I don't propose the folklore to replace more academic studies of official documents or census reports or parish registers or workhouse records or any of those things. But I do think that it adds something to that hadn't been much added to the mix or to our general understanding of the famine. Before I started to work on, one or two people had used the material a little bit, but not very much. And so what I intend to do with this talk is to go through just some of the memories or some of the record that's held in the National Folklore Collection, Cruasach Bailey's Erin, in UCD. It's in large manuscript volumes. When I initially began the work, I went through the card index that they had there and looked for what they held classified under the famine. And if memory serves me, it came to something like 10,000 manuscript pages, which is a lot. But I read through it, took notes with a view to the two radio series that I was going to make. So I've looked at the main manuscript collection, which is was put together by the work of the full-time and part-time collectors of the Commission. I've also looked at a questionnaire that was circulated in 1945 to look at the 100th anniversary of the famine. And that was a system that had been worked out by the Commission because they knew that they didn't have enough collectors to do all the work that they wanted to do, and had to come up with ways and means of putting out feelers and collecting as much as they could around the country. So they engaged with the schools, the senior students in the schools, and instead of the weekly essay, they were asked to do a weekly folklore collection, and that became the essay. Lots and lots of schools all around the country engaged in it. Unfortunately, the Department of Education in Northern Ireland didn't take part in the scheme, so there's none of that available from there. But what the scheme did provide, as well as the information that came through the school system, was a network of school teachers, particularly primary school teachers, people who were interested in folklore. So every so often a particular topic was chosen and a questionnaire was sent out to these people, who then asked locally for information on it. So I've looked at the material that came in from the questionnaire, the material in the main manuscript collection, but I haven't engaged at all with the schools collection, which is all available online now for people who want to have a look at it themselves from various parts of the country. So I'll start off with a piece that was collected from a woman called Maureen Gillespie. She was born in 1876. She was from Dirrin-na-Mancher, which is between Crawley and Annagry in Donegal. If any of you have ever visited Leo's Tavern, Minalicka, if you just kept on going, you'd go up to Dirrin-na-Mancher. She had this to say. I'll read this in her words in Irish first, and then I'll give a translation. Vitihe in Sachantar Shaw, Ur a ro unto a lig bas, Lishin Evas, August Narkaru the Yer Biaku. Vi en sail ho Halkins an Am Shaw. Gur Kama lo din Yer Bi, Kajimaravi again din Ella. Fago Ahan Shawlach unto Hain, August Niron Ninye, ek chatas chat no Mahaku. Hasin na Chowli ek file wash. Agus vi an chodjela aku ho lag, agus ad friedje hele, na roosje abelte, ja hi janu diefe, ach liggen diefe, goor een dinje jernach da roose tja was. Vi a roose tja lig maru, agus na karpen ali, hau agus oos friedje tja. Nier bago as in rioed, vi kujor de wadi akrahe go hart, agus jersje jier sawain, grom wadi ag dulles jas na tihe sha, agus I gihe na garp. There were houses in this area where everyone in them died from fever and none of them were buried. Life was so bad at the time that nobody cared how other people were. Every household was left to themselves and they had no one come visiting. Families started dying and some people were so weak and so far through other that they could do nothing for them but leave them on their own until the last member of the household died. Everyone in the house dead, and the bodies lying here and there through the house. They were never moved. There were hungry dogs going into the houses and eating the corpses, God save us. So that's a fairly harrowing, but not unusual description of what happened in areas. A lot of people died not from directly from lack of food, but from the diseases that accompanied famine and malnourishment. We'll go over to the other side of Ulster to a man called Peter Sloan. He was born in 1912. He was from Glenaloughlin in Moran Parish, County Down. And Michael G. Murphy, I think, collected this piece from him. I heard my grandmother say that up in Tully Frame, Moran Parish, County Down, she knew fine people to be seen lying dead along the roads and in the fields. It seems they fell dead out of their standing, and the dogs eating at them. They mustered up, she said, in bunches like, them that felt getting weak. I heard her say that, and then they went away to some place, away out a long lake, and one done what they could for the other till they died. Back to Donegal again. Again, there's a shortage of material from Derry and indeed from Inishowen because there were no full-time collectors working there. This is from Neil O'Duffy of Anvaltanya, Gorta Horshke. He was born in the 1870s. He was an excellent folklore informant. He had a huge knowledge of the past, a wonderful teller of tales about social history. And Sean O'Hahey, the famous folklore collector, who lived in Gorta Ork as well, collected a huge amount of material from him. I'll just give one or two examples of it here. Hulama amra gominik gomio konraha mishoiga aku. Is stecha ganakwa shaw a curti and carp. And shin curti maja tras na fui. Agus jumpraha catter far on the relige. Nura hikusid ad lisha relig, niru lejano aku, ach an lube a winchamach den teachan, agus an carpel agin chies in sanui, ho soccer agus a bejer. Verdish an honer a rais no ala law shin, na niru doyerbi alaku sanam de edachur. I often heard of slip coffins. The corpse would be put into one of these. Then a stick would be put across underneath it, and 4 men would carry it to the cemetery. All that had to be done was to pull the stick out from the loop that held it and let the body fall into the grave as softly as possible. They would take the coffin back home with them, for they had no other way of burying them at the time. Another piece that Neil O'Duffy supplied describes how some people have their own, I suppose, food strategies, survival strategies, even when things like soup kitchens were set up. Here again is an example of what happened in his area. They would make broth in the large boilers, many of which you can still see in various places. So Neil said, Harwan broth seo a chuide bar in Amani. Chomaithle prachas fiola a bheon. Harshid min sias, agus an chorca war seo, an chorca war seo, agus vrechid an chumlan fridge chéile. Jan hi lan an chorca war de sin, oer sa teachtan, a dosach agus in jerin na seachtanje. Basic na dini na lehile teacht, agus higgetjid lena god gogan, as a han chearn da tivo was na parasjan seo, o vin larach go fan hui. Vi kodjaku olach go mai, agus ni hakgetjid an headwitcher. Agus da jiku heen, danachhetjid gúl godukti hiúl an head skaid den rot. Ba an chodje balú waith den rot vi uchter. Agus sjokker an vin a veg ag Vies acu go lihu an vin hies a hoin. Agus go wijid rod mai lager go jerannach, a ma níos mó minne an ná mar a bhód den brot, agus barla an brachan seo ná an brot hain. Hulama an janwinter ag fachtar sin go minnig. This broth wasn't the best of times. As well as whatever scrag ends of meat was in it, they put meal into this big pot, and they were all boiled up together. They would cook a full boiler of this twice a week. The people knew what days to come, and they'd arrive with their wooden noggins from all ends of this side of the parish, from Minlarach to Fanoí. Some of them were clever enough, and they wouldn't come first, and if they did, they hung back until the first portion of the broth was given out. The least beneficial part of the broth was at the top, and because of the meal that went into it, they knew that that would lie at the bottom, and they would get good thick stuff at the end, where there would be more meal, and they preferred this porridge than the broth itself. Staying with relief food, if we go to South Ulster, for example, to Emmyvale, County Monaghan, where material was collected in the 30s, 40s and 50s. One of the things about this, sometimes when people hear about soup kitchens, they presume that what was called the proselytization, that often was called superism, was going on. And they weren't necessarily connected at all. Lots and lots of soup kitchens set up locally give to people according to their needs, and that's all there was about it. There were examples in a few places of superism, and here's a piece that shows that the person who gave the information sort of knew the difference of what had happened in their area to what might be perceived by mentioning the soup kitchen. There was a food kitchen in the townland of Braca. Both broth and porridge were distributed. The meal was brought from Newry and carts, and this took 3 days to go and 3 days to come back. It was usually a Protestant farmer's house was chosen for the distribution of porridge. A ladleful was given out every day except Sunday, when 2 ladlefuls were given out on the previous Saturday. The people used to line up with the noggins for their share of the food. There's no count of either superism or proselytism in this area. Another family memory of famine times comes from a Miss Anderson, who was born in 1865, who lived in Brooks, Forkhill, County Armagh. My grandfather, who was Brooks, of course, was the first to bring Indian meal into this part of the country. He brought in a full boatload and had it carted up to keep the people from starving. You'll see a huge boiler outside here in the shed, which was used in the famine years for cooking porridge. It was set up in the boardroom of the church then, of course. It was built in, and they made porridge in the morning and soup in the evening. I'm afraid I can't say what kind of soup. The porridge was Indian meal, of course. It was definitely an individual thing, a charity, I suppose. That's definite. It had no connection with any government scheme to relieve hunger or want. My own grandmother superintended it all. And I think that's fairly typical of the type of memories that you get in the oral lore about the famine, where individuals are remembered for acts of kindness, like that. Sometimes people are remembered for acts of unkindness, maybe being unfair in sharing out relief food, that type of thing, and they'd be remembered by name. Whereas I really don't think I ever came across mention of the name of a prime minister or the Queen, or a relief official. The memories are very local to what happened in the area. That's what people talked about. That's what the local landscape prompted people to remember and talk about. They would see a place where people had been buried. They would see a place where relief food had been given out. So it's sort of very much rooted in the landscape and the local community. Here's another story from which was taken down from Mr. Gwynn, described as a Protestant gentleman from Ballymoney, Rostrevor, County Down. I mind my father and my grandfather collecting off the gentry to provide for the poor people. Only for that, the people would have starved. They had no money. There was plenty of other food, although the potatoes all went rotten in the fields, but the people had no money to buy it. The food was bought with this collection and was distributed at the old barracks in Rostrevor. Apart from that, the ladies had a fund of their own to provide for the poor. In those days, the poor had nothing to provide for them. There was no poorhouse and one had to be set up. With the money collected, they bought turf. My father and grandfather attended the meeting many times indeed. The turf wasn't given out all at once, you see. The poor were careless and wouldn't look after it. And if it was given out all at once, they'd have none of it when that time of year came. Another piece collected again in the same area, this time from a woman called Susan Murphy from Drummondtee, County Armagh. Now, Michael J. Murphy, the folklore collector, was from Drummondtee, County Armagh as well, so I presume that she was a relation of Michael's. They had a big trough or boiler or whatever it was. Oh, it was way out about 2 yards in diameter from her gesture. And he, Willie Jordan, always had a lot of meal, oaten meal, and they paid him for it too, to make porridge at McGill's Drummondtee. And I mind me going up to a rock above our house, Jordan's Tifferum, where the roses grew, and taking them down and cleaning the roots and all of them, and cutting up the leaves, and that went into the boiler. And many a time they'd just go into a field of oats and pull the pressure and put that in. There was nothing at all. And at McGill's they'd come with their wee tin in their turn and get some, and Willie Jordan was over it. And it wasn't every day they'd make it, but maybe every other day, and it would be in the evening. That was the time the pretties went bad. Some died with the hunger, but not many. And from County Antrim, Joe McConaughey was born in 1892. He was a farmer from Mullarts, Ramone Parish, Ballycastle. And he was talking about what his mother had told him about famine times. She talked about people being in a coma. They would be waking them at a wake, and they wouldn't be dead at all. She talked of some man from Kerry that was burying his wife that time, and the man noticed some movement in the coffin and took the lid off, and his wife was there wondering where she was. She said he had nothing but his overcoat to put around her and take her home. And she lived for long after that. It was true enough that, and there was others like it. So you have recollections, various memories of what happened in particular places, which you maybe don't mean much on a national level or from an overview, but they do give a very human picture of individual incidents that happened in particular families and in particular areas. Sometimes the stories weren't as sad and graphic as some of those that I've just mentioned. And often not only did you get lore about exactly what had happened in an area, but you also got lore expressed in the form of legends. Now, a legend would differ from a folktale, would differ from oral history in some ways. The thing about a legend is usually it employs local names of people and local place names because it's meant to be credible. And in the example or two that I have here, the reason that it becomes expressed in that way is they're using forms that have already been there to give moral example, as it were, to help the community adhere and help each other. And these stories, which are the basis of which are much, much older than the famine, hundreds and perhaps thousands of years older than the famine, shows that people who did good things were rewarded, and quite often the opposite is told as well. So some of the legends, here's one that was collected in Belmullet in County Mayo from a man called Padraig O'Croher, who was born in 1875. Paddy Lavelle lived with his wife in Cross. He was called Paddy Major, as he must have been working with Major Bingham. They were very poor, as they had no money to earn. Next to them lived another very poor couple, and if one of them was without meal, the other woman would give her some. One day, the woman next door to Mrs. Paddy Major asked for some meal, as she had no time to grind some of her own that day. Mrs. Lavelle hadn't much to spare either, but she gave her some of it and told her if she could at all to bring meal over to her in the evening. The woman told her that she would have some ground by that time and that she would bring her some. Evening came and still they didn't come with the meal, so that Mrs. Lavelle said she'd have to scrape the bottom of the chest and try and get as much as she would to do her husband for supper. When she went to the chest and opened it, she found that it was full to the top, and she dropped to her knees and thanked God. She was like that when the other woman came in with the meal, and she too went on her knees when she saw that the chest was full of meal. Mrs. Lavelle told her to bring the meal home again and to come for some any time she wanted it. That was the time of the famine, and when the neighbours heard about the meal, they all flocked round the house and none of them ever went away empty. They came from far and wide to get some of the meal and stir about, and there was always a pot down on that fire. That example was from Mayo, but I've come across examples of it from all over the place. One of the ones I remember hearing in Ring, County Waterford, an Irish-speaking area there, and I'd gone down to collect songs in general, nothing particularly to do with the famine. But one of the few songs that has lasted in oral tradition from famine times is Na Prati Dua, the black potatoes, which was composed by a woman from Anrine, Rhinagunach, Maura Nigroma. And the person who was one of the singers, indeed, that I was recording was giving me a quick tour around the area. And we passed Religate the graveyard there where Maura is supposed to be, is buried. And the person was telling me a similar story to the one that we've heard there, where Maura had a field of cabbages beside her house, and any poor hungry person who came begging, she'd give them a cabbage. And this was going on for a while, and her husband started to worry that there wouldn't be enough for themselves. And Maura said, yeah, that she'd pay attention, and that was good advice. And he went away off working somewhere distant, and she continued on giving out the cabbages to anyone who came. And eventually the husband arrived home again, and he wanted to see had she been following the advice that he gave, and she was dreading it when he went out the back of the house to the field where the cabbages were. And lo and behold, there was an entire field full of cabbages that had miraculously reappeared due to her kindness. And that's what you tend to get in these moral lessons that were drawn from the famine. Another example of something quite similar from County Cork, just to give an idea of the spread of legends like that. And these were all believed to have happened in the local place. This was collected from a man called Ned Buckley from Knocknagree, County Cork, on the Kerry border. I often heard that old Mrs. Crimmin, the grandmother of Father John Crimmin, Lissy Connor Rathmore, was very good and full of charity to the poor and hungry in the famine days. She used to always boil a lot of potatoes for the meals, and she never used the ones left over after dinner for either pigs or cows or poultry, but collected the best of them and put them near the fire in order to have a few of them for any hungry poor person who happened to chance to call at the house for some bite to lessen their mad hunger. A few potatoes, half cold, and a basin of milk was a great boon to such starving people, and often they went away blessing the house and the owners of it. Many were the poor mother and father who came to her for one single head of cabbage she had growing in a field. It was poor fare, but it kept many a family from starving in those days. A head or a couple of head of cabbage, boiled with a pinch of salt, were divided out among the family, and if they had enough of that, they'd be thankful. One day her husband, seeing as much cabbage being carried away as went into the house to blame her for giving away the cabbage, and asked her did she mean to leave themselves with nothing at all. She denied giving away as much of it, and said that she only gave away a few heads to a few poor women who were starving. Come out now, said the man of the house, and show me what cabbages left for herself. She went out fearing the worst and hoping he would not blame her too much for helping God's poor. But when they reached the cabbage field, great was her surprise to find that there was not a single head missing out of the whole field. There it was, the whole field of cabbage, without the loss of a single head, but what was used for her own household. She was greatly surprised and went on her knees to give thanks to God for thus miraculously saving her from her husband's censure and for acknowledging her kindness to the poor. Her husband was speechless with surprise, and he knew well she had been giving away the cabbage and refusing none of it. He was as impressed by this miracle that he told her to continue on the way she was doing, and that he'd never again object to her helping God's poor. So a moral lesson and encouragement to help people in need. There are several examples of that. I won't go along too long on them. One of the things that some people believe, not everyone. In fact, to some extent, it featured in providentialism in government thinking that really the famine was a punishment for the wayward natives in Ireland. But some people also felt that when something bad happened, that maybe it was punishment for something that they'd done. So here's an example from Moat in County Westmeath. So plentiful were the potatoes in pre-famine years that it often happened that farmers filled them into sacks, took them to markets in Moat, Athlone and Ballymahon, offered them for sale, but nobody could be found to buy them. So that on the return journey, the farmers often emptied them into a ditch on the roadside, for they weren't worth the sacks they were in. Afterwards, it was said that the famine was a just retribution from God for the great waste of food. A local saying which may refer to this is, "A woeful waste makes a woeful want." I suppose the time is catching up with us. I'll finish with a piece from Máire Ní Grianna from around the Farste in Donegal. She was born around 1864. Now, as you may have noticed, the people whose memories, whose lore was collected, weren't actually alive during the famine years. These were the people, these were the children and sometimes the grandchildren of people who survived the famine largely. So these were the memories that were passed on from one generation to the next generation. And they're really the only record that we have of many of the things that happened in these small, isolated rural communities all around the country. So I'll finish with this piece because it says a lot about the cultural damage, the rupture that was caused in the country by the famine, by the death, by the emigration, by the sadness, by the change that it wrought in people's minds and how it changed the culture of Ireland. Máire Ní Grianna. Hannig blianta an garta agus an droch héal agus an tacras, agus bhris neart agus spirid na nini. Ní raibh a ahanine I giri a bheith beá. Chail siad an daimh le chéile. Ba chuma céhí géalhairdit. Ba da charad an ché a bheith grimdit le corrad de bhéal. Jimmy an sport agus an caiú aimsire. Stad an iliocht agus an ceol agus an dausa. Chail siad agus rinn siad jarmad den umwa. Agus nuair a bhisi an saoil a gáin eile. Ní hannig le rud is seo rio a rais mar a bhí siad. Warú an garta a an rud. The famine and the hard times and the hunger came and broke the strength and spirit of the people. Everyone just wanted to survive. They lost their fellow feeling. It didn't matter who you were related to. Your friend was the person who would give you something to eat. There was an end to sport and pastimes. Poetry and music and dancing stopped. The people lost these things and forgot everything. And even when life improved in other ways, these things didn't go back to the way they were. The famine killed everything. So those are just a few of the folk memories, the lore of the famine that were collected by the Irish Folklore Commission, particularly in the 1930s and 40s, some after that. Now, there are other sources where material like that can be found in memoirs and some in literature as well. But I think that that type of telling of what had happened in a community does make our understanding of the famine more human. It puts a human face on the statistics and the figures that would be supplied by official reports and a lot of studies. I'm not suggesting that it replace other things, but my contention has always been that it's a way into understanding the pain and the loss and the experience of the famine at a level that most of us can readily understand, whereas we might be blinded by figures looking at graphs and tables of mortality and disease and things like that. So I hope that was in some way enlightening. I published much of this material in 2 books. The material that I collected, or that I put together in English, a compendium called Famine Echoes, which was published by Gill and Macmillan. I think it's out of print, but it may be available in an electronic form. And the material that I collected in Irish, I put in book form as Glórta on Gorta, and that was published by Coscéim. I'm pretty sure that's out of print, and I'm pretty sure that it's not available. But libraries are wonderful things, and I hope you manage to find a copy of one or both of the books if you want to. So thank you very much for listening. Gurmila Mahibuv.